So I want to ask Percival to spend a little bit of time talking with us about painting the novel and why you decided that this work was necessary.
Well, I don't know if it's a decision as much as it I think this is not a good place for this, as much as it simply happened. My visual work has never dovetailed, or actually even as far as I've been consciously aware, I've been in conversation with the literary work. But it seemed at the end of the trees, somehow my work felt undone, and then these paintings just started to come, and I realized that they were a part of the same. You know, it takes me a while to work through stuff with novels, and so themes of novels will overlap, and 2 or 3 books those things will all be mixed in until they are sort of organically moved to something else. And this time, the second work was this show.
And do you, of course, as someone who has written about lynching and mob violence, particularly about Black women as victims of mob violence, and I did notice that you might have noticed that 2 of the pieces that I pulled from the collection were Eliza Wood and Dorothy Malcolm, and this issue that you raise of not being finished.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if there's something particular about the subject itself of this book that made you feel that by the end of it you weren't finished and you had to express it in another form.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of a huge and sad unfinished. It's not. Well, it's twofold. One is those lives having been cut short and erased from history, because so many of these murders became a part of a larger picture of lynching instead of these individual crimes. But also that the creature of lynching, let's call lynching a creature, is so alive in our culture. The perpetrators have moved from masked cowards to badged cowards, and so we see it with there's so many more of us with our media. We see that there are it's even more prevalent in our society, but we look right at it when it's happening now, and it's hidden in a different way.
In your artwork, can you put up one of the images? It doesn't matter which one. I think they're abstract, but they're very explicit, right, in some ways. And I'm wondering, and I remember us talking about the form and talking about the ideas of erasure and abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about what abstraction does, or what work it's doing in your art, in the painting, versus what it's doing in trees, which is very explicit, right?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because I still have a lot of trouble with the word abstract.
Mm-hmm.
People say, what are your paintings? And I use abstract because I don't like non-representational, because I don't like anything defined by what it is not.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the probably the significant example of that is when you and I go out to fill out forms, and it says white, Native American, non-white, and that's not how I think of myself. here in these paintings, what's you know, I didn't draw literal, in my mind even, literal images that I then abstracted into. I created them as non-representational, for lack of a better term, from the beginning. But the tension that one feels, and the name of the show is Once Seen, is if you look at one of the paintings and you realize whether it's from studying it or somebody saying it to you, once you see a lynching, you can't unsee them in any of the paintings, and they can't hide. Mm-hmm. That bothers me, but also delights me. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I had called the show Lynchings, right, then the paintings would have no power at all. Well, to me. But the idea that that's not in the title and not what I mean. Mm-hmm. And then, again, the names do some work. Right. The remarkable thing about the names is there's so many of them that they become meaningless.
Well, we'll talk about the meaning and the naming, because you do give meaning to the names in the trees, yes, right? Which makes me want to spend a little bit of time talking about, and you may not want to talk about this, because when people ask me this question, I don't have a lot to say, in part because I really want to hear from other people what they think about the work. But I'm wondering, and I can't help think about audience, whether it's a viewer or a reader, right? And that when we choose abstraction that is working towards seeing or undoing erasure, what is the work that you expect the viewer to do, if there's any work to do?
You know, well, one of the wonderful things about art is that once you let it go, you have no control of it. So I don't have any expectations in that way. Though I suspect, and what I would like is that it does different things predictably to different audiences, and in a very crude way. For some, it would be mere education. And I hate to think about art in that way, but necessarily it is in this case. But then there's another one that's even harder to say, and that is there should be a difference in black and white reception of the paintings. For either one of those viewers, it should be outrage, not a feeling that Americans tend to cling to for very long when it is felt. And for the black viewer of it, it should be grief and anger. And for a white viewer, I would hope it would be shame.
I mean, those are deep emotions, right?
Sure.
That many people work through in therapy, right? Where they can even acknowledge shame and grief. We're better at embarrassment, right?
Yes, that's very good.
And, you know, I think about my own work, and I remember the first draft of Southern Horrors. One of my readers, a dear friend, she sent it back to me after reading it, and she was like, "I know you're mad. You're mad. I can hear your outrage, and you are." She said, "You're not so much lecturing your reader, but you have lectured the folks in the past. You're mad at the black club women because they didn't do this. You're mad at the white women because they did this. You're mad at Southern whites." And so she said to me, "We want to be outraged, right? The reader, we will be outraged, but your job as the writer is to get us there without telling us we should be there.
Well, exactly.
Right?
Well, and that's many years ago. I was a part of the state flag of South Carolina coming off the State House. I was invited by the South Carolina State Legislature to address that body about the arts. And I immediately said yes, because I knew I had nothing to say to them. And I stood up and I said, I cannot speak to this body because of the symbol of exclusion that's standing behind me. And the governor, then I sat down. The governor got up and tried to make it all nice. And then it came off the State House onto the state grounds, and now it's gone completely. And so many years later, I now disagree with myself. I was wrong. I think the Confederate flag belongs on the State House until, without any need for discussion, it's taken down. Otherwise, it exists in a place where it should stand as a marker to the rest of us of the dangers that are present. In the same way that I would want a sign at the edge of a minefield that says mines.
And I guess, the question remains is how do we, and what forms do we use of art, right? So it could be painting, it could be fiction, it could be history, to move people to have those conversations and to do that work. We know people have town halls. We know people do all kinds of things, right? And I know I made a choice in my own work where I was trying to write about black and white women, and students will say to me, black students will say to me, you put Ida B. Wells, who is a black woman who is an anti-lynching activist, in the same book with Rebecca Latimer Felton, who was an advocate of lynching. And the students would say, some students will say, she doesn't deserve to be in the same book with Ida B. Wells. We felt like you have slighted Ida B. Wells by putting her. And I said, well, that was a strategic move because I wanted you to think about the world and the people that Ida B. Wells had to be thinking about and in conversation. But I also wanted you to get a sense of who Rebecca Latimer Felton was and why she believed what she believed and how she came to change her mind over the long haul, right? So that in my mind, I understood the work as initiating different kinds of conversations, going back to what you said about education, right? And so I'm wondering if you could talk about the link between fiction, and I know you don't do nonfiction, you're not a nonfiction writer, and you talk about the power of the art of fiction. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that in relationship to history and the work of educating the next generation about the past through fiction. And painting. We are in the art gallery, so.
Well, I think they do the same thing actually. These are not photographs of lynching, and the interesting thing about the horrible photographs that exist of lynchings is that they weren't made as works of art, but they had these lives in the world as works of art. They were postcards that people would sell, collect. I don't think the American culture is that much worse than any other culture in the world, but it is ours, and it's an ugly one. I'm committed to fiction, and a fight that that's ongoing for me as someone who practiced the fictive art is is that more and more readers don't know how to read. And you see it in the smallest ways, the way that movies are sold to people. The phrase that I really hate is based on a true story. No matter what it is, it's based on a true story. First of all, it's a lie. Everything's based on a true story in some way. But it's appealing to this voyeuristic part of people that wants to think that it really happened before they will even invest in a story. And it frees them of any type of interpretive effort. And I read history all the time, and I probably wouldn't write if I didn't. But there's a difference, and really great history, of course, reveals to us some truths. A lot of history reveals to us mere facts. One thing we get with art is truth. There may not be a single fact in a story about what happened in the Ford Theater in 1865. I think that's the right year. I can imagine dialogue between Lincoln and his wife, and it can be true without appealing to any evidence or fact. On the other hand, I can be very factual about what goes on and not provide any truth. So that's, but more importantly, suppose I describe something that never happened, that could possibly happen. And that's what I would want our readership to be able to do. Take that and make that real in the world without needing to believe that it actually happened for a point of entry.
I love that, because at the end of the conversation where my colleague said to me, you know, you don't have to tell us to be outraged.
Mm-hmm.
She said, your job is to give us a sense of what was possible
Oh, I like that.
for
Yeah.
those folks. And so thinking about your art and thinking about your fiction as helping us imagine what is possible right now,
Mhm.
right, is really beautiful. And I wrote down, I had, in sort of thinking about my questions, I had abstraction and truth next to each other. And then a little bit further down, I have, you know, truth and history.
Mhm.
Because I think there is different work around questions of truth when you're working with, in different mediums, right? Whether it's a play or it's a canvas. And I find it striking that you place your art in conversation with the crisis, right? Which is an archive that I use in my book, right? So I'm wondering if you could talk about that choice and what you were hoping would happen when people opened. So the images that you see are inside the 1915 edition of The Crisis, which is the magazine that the NAACP put out, and it was during 1915, what we know as the Red Summer. But it's the pages.
Yes, the actual magazine.
So can you talk a little bit about that and the
Well,
stakes of doing it this way?
Well, my research for the novel, I very much liked the character Mama Z. I started collecting the names of victims of lynching. One of my sources became this issue of Crisis. And as I was making the show, I had no idea I was going to use this in that way. We talked about making a catalog of the work, and it occurred to me that that unlike my other work, these paintings were a literary extension, and also an extension of the sources that allowed me to write this novel, and to make the paintings. So it sort of is an homage to the crisis and all the work the NAACP did in those years, sending Walter White down south to investigate lynchings and that sort of thing. And he, of course, was head of the organization for a long time. And I, though it was in public use, I didn't have to ask them for permission to use it, but I did anyway. And their response was very generous. But ironically, though, what I love about this issue of it, and I'm sorry I didn't think to bring a bunch of them for everyone, is the articles and the sort of the demographic breakdown of the lynching and the geographic breakdown of lynching that's fascinating in there is it's a great resource. But the ads of black people in 1919 looking for schools and jobs is really moving to me. So that while you're seeing this document about the taking of life, you see people really trying to continue in this world.
You mentioned Mama Z, and I want to talk about, if we can, and if you feel, I'm talking about gender and how they play out in the art, because I did choose two, because I do think a lot of people, when they think about mob violence, they imagine the sole victim as a black man. And you're disrupting that narrative with the art. And in terms of also thinking about how we think about anti-lynching activists and the ways in which black people push back against mob violence. I think The Trees plays with that, with the kind of gender politics of anti-lynching work. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of gender implications of your work and what you're playing with.
Well, just looking at the names, it's hard to miss that there are men and women, black and Italian and Chinese, in the abbreviated list that I have supplied. It's, you know, Mama Z has and she's a wonderfully strong character, even to me.
She's a historian.
Yeah, she is a historian. She's an archivist, whose father was lynched, and I think in the novel it says 1913, and she has kept a record of every lynching since that time. But I tried to avoid having her be that inscrutable, character, the black woman root doctor kind of thing. I tried to avoid that by giving her a real sense of irony. I think, and you can tell me if this works, that she's sort of out of time. Right. She's a lot more modern than anyone else in the novel. And I think what I hope for her is that her living language is a testament to the pervasiveness of the practice of lynching.
You have her, of course, I love that you have her, by the end of the book, it's her and the professor, right? And it is the work that they both do separately and together that bring the novel to its climax, right? And so there's a part of me that, again, is moved by the way in which you're using history and fiction, abstraction and surrealism to really retell this history, right, of lynching, but playing with two very different characters and two different ways of archiving this history. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the professor in this narrative of writing this history and playing with history.
Well, he's a work in progress.
We all are.
But he's hyperbolically over accomplished, but that hasn't done anything for his situating himself with himself and in the culture. He's looking. He's lost, and I don't know if it comes through, but without putting him in any real jeopardy at any point, I wanted him to be a possible target. If anybody would be lynched, it would be Damon Thruff, and I play with names all the time, and some of my characters have strange names, and I'll confess, I never tell anybody what anything means in my head, but Damon Thruff is diamond in the rough, and so that's the.
But do you see him as an artist at the end of the day? Because you have him doing a kind of work that is not what we think about because Mama Z's done the kind of academic work of being a historian and creating an archive. And what he comes in and does is write the names, erase the names. It felt like he was working on a canvas in some ways, right?
Well, I never thought of that, but it's good, and I'm going to take credit for it.
You should. You wrote it.
Well, as you say it, there's a scene in my novel Erasure, and again, I work through things all the time, and it's of Rauschenberg and de Kooning. Rauschenberg asked, and this work actually exists, but not the dialogue that goes along with it. But Rauschenberg asked de Kooning to draw him a picture, and de Kooning draws this picture, and he spends lots of time making it with grease pencil and ink and all this. And then he gives it to Rauschenberg, who painstakingly attempts to erase it. He uses eraser after eraser, rubbing on it. And obviously not all of it is erased, but he then solves it. And the dialogue that I have is that de Kooning says, "Where's my drawing?" He says, "Well, I erased it and sold it." He said, "You sold my drawing?" He said, "No, I erased your drawing. I sold my erasure." and that's that's behind that whole thing of the erasing the names.
But it does work, right? It can be. We often think about erasure as always doing harm, right?
Yeah,
but that it
that's
can be
right.
productive. And at the end of Trees, the writing and the erasure are doing work, right? That he has a whole argument about why he's writing the names and why he's erasing the names. And then, spoiler alert, right, at the end, he's like, do you want him to stop writing the names, right? Because we understand it's the conjuring, right? That she's not the root woman, but he's the root man conjuring.
Yes.
The I don't know if we can call them zombies, but
I guess they are. I don't know, but it's interesting that you chose Eliza Woods.
yeah.
I didn't know that you had worked on Eliza Woods, but the that story and the thing that crushes me even as I think about the book is I physically didn't have the time to research every victim, and the novel is about every one of these people having a story, but I don't know every one of their stories, but I know that they're there. But we were talking about white shame, and I've often Eliza Wood was accused of poisoning her, the woman who owned her, and she was hanged for this. And then I don't know how many years later, the woman's husband confessed to having killed his wife. And the part of the story that I want to explain to me is, was it shame that had him finally confess? And you know more about this story than I do. What do you think?
I would say guilt.
Yeah, or guilt.
More than shame.
Yeah.
But I also know that it becomes, it's the case that makes, it's the case that makes Ida B. Wells, right, in many ways. And so I think it matters when, why I'm a fan of Ida B. Wells and why I'm a fan of your work and your art is that it matters to name, right? Even in fiction, even in abstraction, right? And that our job as writers, as artists who are deeply invested in Black life, right, is to make people do the work of understanding this past, understanding the moment they live, and figuring out how do they feel about it. And what do they want to do about it, right? And it's easy for me to say, you should be angry, right? But I think the work of abstraction, and I think the conversation we had a few weeks ago about the art, is that we have an expectation of our readers and our viewers, even if we can't name it, to bring something to bear on the work. I always say to my students, you don't come, we have a common text, but you're bringing something into the conversation. You're bringing who you are and who you want to be in dialogue with this, right? And we're hoping that it speaks to who people want to be, right? So I love abstraction, right? Because I think it's really powerful. Because you can put the facts at the bottom, but then the viewer has to look and try to understand, what is this compelling in me, right? Because I could try to figure out what you were trying to do, but I can never know. I can only know how it makes me feel.
Yeah.
How are we with time? Because I got a few more. Oh, we got, my watch is not, what time is it? Does it say 4:27 or 4:37? Okay, we got a little bit more time before I open it up. So I want to talk about, it's clear, that you use humor and comedy in your work. There's a lot of irony, and as someone who works on rape and lynching, I often say to people, this isn't dinner conversation, and I try to make jokes and humor, and it's really hard, right? But I did laugh in the trees, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk about what humor is, what work it does for you, and how, is it here? Is it in the art? Is it in the paintings?
I would say in some of them there is it's pretty hidden, but it'll be in the presence of something that appears to be of whimsy in a very dire circumstance. And it's not so much humor as it is sort of something that's incongruous. And that's kind of how humor works. Anyway, I mean, I don't write comedy. Apparently, it's funny, but I think I even said this week. One of my instructors is Twain, and I firmly believe that humor is a disarming tool. If you can get someone laughing, then they're open. Then you can do all sorts of horrible things to them, and that's what it's all about, isn't it? Is doing horrible things to people. But but that's, and if anyone knew how to write comedy, it would be easy to write. I don't know how to write comedy. I know that people are weird, and I just try to make weird people.
I mean, when I picked up the book, I read fiction. I know there's a historian in the room. I only read history because I have to read them for prize things, and because I have to teach it. But I read fiction mostly, right? And so oftentimes I avoid the things that are fictional things that are very close to my work on racial and sexual violence, because it's a refuge, it's a respite from. So when I picked up, I was like, okay, I'm gonna read this. It's gonna be heavy, but it is and it isn't, right?
Well, do you remember the film 12 Years a Slave?
Okay, so I love movies and I will binge everything. I did not go see 12 Years a Slave because I could not do it.
Well, I mean...
But I know what it's about, and I've read the slave narrative because I have to teach it.
But the thing is, another movie about slavery, I mean, what am I supposed to say as I walk out of the theater? Wow, I've changed my mind about slavery. I mean, there's nothing new in that. I have all sorts of problems with that film, but I'm really tired of the same thing.
Yeah. So I feel like there is, as your phrase, I think, was the power of fiction, fiction, and I think there's also the power of humor, right? And particularly when you have to delve in these dark places, and particularly because for Black people and Black lives, for so long, the minstrel was the form of humor as it related to Black people's lives. And to be able to hold the darkness in the light. And I mean that like lightness, to bring kind of lightness to it, is really a gift. So I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you.
For that,
That's really nice.
because I really was dreading the read and fell in love with the book. So.
Yes, and I've tricked you into reading my other books, which are not funny at all. I'm sorry.
Some of them are.
Part of the brain that reads fiction, is that to you the same part of the brain that reads a painting like this? Is it one kind of reading, or are they separate processes?
Well, first of all, I like that you use reading in that way. If we could expand our notion of reading to include
all sorts of consummation of stuff, then maybe it wouldn't be so off-putting to American culture. Is it the same part of the brain? I don't know. I do know that there are plenty of people who, when they see people interact on the street, I used this example earlier this week, and they see them shake hands a few times and look sort of covertly around, they can read a situation and realize it's a drug deal. That's reading. And I think if more people in our culture accepted the fact that reading a text is just like reading the world and reading each other and reading situations, that it would not be as daunting to them, and they might participate in the activity more frequently. I also would like to live in a society where the language of difficult reading does not exist. I really hate it when students say, this is a hard book to read, in a negative way. I would like him to say, for maybe that, yeah, this is hard to read, and boy, this is fun. That the challenge would be what is attracting them to it. So our culture's lazy, and, which is why it's much easier to sit back and watch TV than it is to. And even there, there's a difference between watching and reading. You know, we don't read a stop sign, but we stop every time. And the same way, people will consume television shows, but I don't think they're reading them. It's just sort of washing over them. But now I'm preaching, and I'm not very good at that. So, others?
I've read all of your novels. Sorry.
You're the one.
I've read all of them, and The Trees. And I was fascinated that you were putting up 4 of these paintings and wanted to see how you tied in those paintings with, or how you see them coming out of the trees. But we only saw 2 of them, 3 of them. I mean, could you tell us a little bit about that connection?
No. I can only say that a general shape of them emerged in making them. It was the first series of paintings that I did that were so connected to each other. And any one of them can be representative of all of them. And I find that unusual for me. And in a way I think seeing 2 of them together gives a sense of it, but though they were sold separately, it sounds like an ad, sold separately. They work in concert with each other. And there really isn't a satisfactory answer to how they tie to a particular text, except that the mission of them is in concert with the text. So I know it's not a very good answer, but that's all I got.
So I think it's really incredible, the sort of alchemy of historical facts and how you deal with hard truths, and then you create art all in that sort of alchemical process. And so my question is, for you, I was curious, when does a fact become truth, and when does truth become art? And I was curious if I can maybe share a little bit more on your thoughts on that.
If you ask me a hard question, I don't know. I'm just a cowboy. I have no idea. That's the magic of it. Even writing the novel, I started out with 400 blank pages, and somehow, out of a mixture of vanity and humility, they become filled with words. I don't know how that happens. It's magic, and I don't know if there's a lot of profit in interrogating that too much. I mean, for me as an artist.
Thank you so much. I'm curious to hear either of you talk about responses to lynching in the Black literary tradition, and whether those, for you, Percival, were in your mind when you were working on either the paintings or trees, aside from the crisis.
Well, I think probably the most successful novel about lynching is the Channingsville incident. Lynchings occur in a number of works, and maybe that's the thing that's kind of disturbing about it is they happen like weather.
Okay.
They happen, and it's a part of the landscape. It's not a place where things stop or end, and anyway, that's how I feel.
You know, my colleague, Jackie Goldsby is the expert on lynching in literature. For me, I was mostly interested in anti-lynching literature, right? Whether that was fiction or nonfiction, and the ways in which women were committed to writing that literature, whether it's one of the Grimke's, Ida B. Wells. So it factors into my work, but I'm gonna be honest. Jackie Goldsby is, I had a moment of like, I probably should tell him to ask Jackie, but I was like, nope, I'm going up here. Yeah, so that's my answer to that question.
This was really a wonderful discussion, and I think the paintings are extremely powerful. I haven't read the novel, but I'm reminded of Leon Golub and Philip Custon when I look at the paintings. And to just take off from the discussion, as you were saying, is abstraction about erasure? Is it about negation? Is it the opposite of language? But I'm also thinking of perhaps Waringer's long ago text, Abstraction and Empathy. So abstraction not as the opposite of realism, but as something which then moves you towards the plane of transcendence. And I think that empathy is what definitely is generated through these works. And as you said, although I haven't read the novel, and he has, in the paintings, he feels that those specters of history are coming out from the trees. So this idea of coming out rather than remaining bound to that history of violence. So I think something has shifted in the perception. This is just an observation.
Oh, I like that, and also your reference to abstraction, that the notion used by the abstract expressionists to get at the underlying justification for abandoning form altogether, I think is correct. It's abandoning the idea that there's any kind of universal, truth. All of the truths that exist here exist individually, and we do. Though it's necessary to understand the largeness of something, we do individuals a disservice when they become a part of a collective when we're viewing these Eliza Wood with other people. It's Eliza Wood's story. Lynching is not her story. She has a different story.
So I think that, I guess when you're dealing with stories, both like true stories or based on true stories, or fictional stories and narratives that deal with like these really horrifying truths, such as lynching and like the kind of fraught American history of violence, I guess there's sort of the like engagement with these realities and like that violence and that horror from like a head-on perspective, like seeing these horrors for what they are and engaging with that reality and legacy. But then I think often, and especially like what you touched on with the based on a true story thing, like that pulls people to the cinemas, there's also this kind of aspect sometimes of like torture porn, I guess, and this like morbid fascination with these horrors that doesn't necessarily come from a place of like empathy and trying to understand these realities, but more just like, I don't know, like the kind of satisfaction people get out of like seeing horrible things, like the reason I guess everyone's super into like true crime. So what do you think are the, I guess, responsibilities of both creators and audiences in trying to deal with that boundary between like morbid torture porn fascination versus a kind of like genuine, sincere engagement with the realities and legacies of horrible things?
I got something to say.
Okay, good.
It's interesting because I'm thinking specifically of the trees, right? And I'm thinking two thoughts at once. So one is that when I said, oh, I was like, oh, I'm not ready for this. And then I was like, oh my God, this is a gift. So part of the reason I kept reading was that I wanted to see what was going to happen to the white people. Like, that I wanted to, like, and when I see the images here, it's interesting that when as I read the book before I saw the images, the paintings, and in the paintings there are lots of penises. At least that's what I see. But having read the book first, I kept reading because I wanted some more white men to get their penises cut off. Like, literally, like that's if you've read the book, the kind of plot. And there's that part of me that was like, it was a morbid kind of fascination and wanting to see more of the kind of violence that was going to be enacted, right? So the thought I'm having at the same time is that one can have that and not want mobs to go out and castrate white men in large numbers. It's the there's the fantasy and the wish. That doesn't make the reality, as my therapist might say. You can wish somebody dead, but you're not really going to kill them. Right? That's okay. So that it raises the question, I think, for me, is that, and I think you've said it maybe even today and in other places, that you create the work, but you can't control what it becomes or how it takes on a life of its own, right? We can have a wish for it, but somebody could jack off to my book all day long, but that's not what I wrote it for. But I can't control that. So you may not have wanted me to read it and wanting to get more of the violent scenes, but I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's really hard to control what happens once it's out in the world.
That's part of the reason I write, is I have no control of it. That's the excitement of it. People always are coming up with things I never thought of about my own work. But you used an interesting word when you were talking about readers' notes. What responsibility do they have? I don't know if they have any responsibility in coming to art. I think all responsibility has to do with how we treat each other, and I'm just an artist. If you go to if you're appealing to an artist for some way to be in the world, you're already lost. And the mere fact that I spend my time making up stories and drawing pictures is ample evidence that I'm mentally deficient, and I'm not a source of any wisdom. But the work itself, any work of art, is, and it is a source because of the work that the viewer will do. It's a work of art that isn't completed until a viewer comes to it.
Hi. First, thanks for speaking to us all week. And I have what sounds like a very simple question, which is because so much of us I have only seen lynching photography. I've only seen pictures of lynching or portraits of lynching in black and white.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, what is color? I know you have no responsibility for what the work it's doing on me, but I think the colors you bring to this violent experience has done a lot for me. I'm leaving here different than when I came, and both. So why don't you speak to that? Because I know time is short, but I didn't think I'd leave with a focus on the individual and empathy, because abstraction usually has a different response for me. But thank you, and then also, can you just speak to your colors, like even the pastels and so forth, in the very first one with Emily Wood.
Well, yeah, I understand. Well, I appreciate that question, because it's in the colors that where the irony resides in these paintings. Black and white is fascinating to me, and I actually did I give that lecture? And I gave a lecture here last year. And one of the things, the jumping off point for that was black and white. In 1938, Howard Hawks shot a movie called Red River, and it's in black and white. And he chose black and white, he said, because he wanted it to be realistic. And I thought, what does that mean? No one sees the world in black and white. So what did he mean? What was he looking for? What kind of realism was he seeking? But yet I understood his desire. And finally, what I understood him to be saying was that the world of cinema for him was in black and white. And so that was the reality of the world he wanted to present. But as you said that, I realized that the reality of lynching for me is in black and white, because those are the images that I have been exposed to. Like the most striking one in my mind right now is in Elaine, Arkansas. And this is also the source of this novel where it comes from. These white men standing around the charred body of a black man on the street. He's been burned to a crisp, but these men are smiling. And the image will forever be in black and white. TNT isn't going to come colorize that for me, so I can see it a different way. But it's those smiling faces that, not the burned man, but those smiling faces. And my first thought about it, they had children, and they probably had grandchildren. What would let's choose one man, what would that man say to his grandchild if she asked him, what are you doing in this picture? back to the guilt and how do you live with yourself if you're that smiling face? So that's the source of the whole work is really that.
I think on that note, we're after 5, and Percival is doing a reading from the trees. So you're more than welcome to attend that and take your questions there as well. But let's give Percival a round of applause. Thank you.